or asking the question, is Donald Trump or could Donald Trump be the Antichrist? And doing a across-the-board web search on the internet, just doing a web search, it is amazing how many people are being caught up into, I wouldn't say a frenzy, but certainly a very over-bloated trend looking at this issue of Mr. Trump, his re-election, and asking, is he the Antichrist? Well, I'd like to give 5 biblical reasons at least why he cannot be the Antichrist. But let's put the issue and the subject and the question in context. When Jimmy Carter became the American president, he was a Southern Baptist from the American South who openly professed to be born again. Now, I'm not his judge. I don't know whether he is born again or was born again, but I know he has said and done some things that would leave much to be desired for anybody who was a born-again Christian, including at one time his compromise with Mormonism and his acceptance of Mormonism as Christianity, among other issues. He had been a member of a church that up until the 1970s had been segregated from black people. I was never a big fan of his. He was a member of David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission. He was very much a proto-globalist. And most people would say he was a failed president. His name and his reputation are not well remembered by history. He's seen as the president of double-digit inflation, a president whose very name was emblematic of a perceived American weakness when the Iranians grabbed the American embassy personnel and he incompetently managed the entire situation. He was a gross disappointment. He was such a bad president, it caused Ronald Reagan to win an election victory that swept 13 liberal Democrats from the U.S. Senate alone and greatly empowered the Republican Party at that time. Then, of course, there was Ronald Reagan. While people had their misgivings about Jimmy Carter saying he was a born-again Christian, we came to Ronald Reagan. There were reasons that people began to see Ronald Reagan in this light, possibly as an Antichrist figure. For one, the Antichrist is preceded and accompanied by a religious figure called the false prophet, popularly the other beast, one of the 2 beasts from Revelation chapter 13. This was Jerry Falwell, who went to great lengths to mobilize evangelical born-again Christian voters across America to vote for Ronald Reagan as if it was a Christian cause. Now, this was not the first time something like this happened. Billy Graham did the same thing, although not to the same degree, in his endorsements of Richard Nixon. But when the Watergate scandal took place, Billy Graham publicly expressed his regret for having endorsed Nixon and said that he's never going to publicly sanction or endorse another candidate for the presidency again. Billy Graham said that Nixon was influenced by demons, by alcohol abuse, and by tranquilizer and barbiturate drug abuse, and so forth. During the Yom Kippur War, Nixon called the Stage 3 alert against the Soviets. At the height of the Watergate scandal, people were afraid he was using an international crisis and pushing the world to a precipice, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, in order to save his neck politically. And Henry Kissinger and General Haig were trying to keep him under control. This caused a lot of problems for Billy Graham and his ministry at the time, among other things. And it caused Billy Graham to regret what he did and what he said. It was later released, recordings and transcripted recordings of Billy Graham and Nixon having a conversation about Jews. And some of the most vile anti-Semitic statements you can imagine, I mean, open anti-Semitism, were made not just by Reagan, but were made by, not just by Mr. Nixon, but by Mr. Billy Graham. Now, Billy Graham was publicly portrayed as a friend of Israel and the Jews and a supporter of Zionism and so forth well, what he said publicly and what he said privately that had become disclosed were two different things. This greatly turned the Jewish community into suspecting him and distrusting him. And it also disappointed many pro-Zionist born-again Christians. The things that Billy Graham had said in his conversations to Nixon were shocking. Now, Mr. Graham did apologize and retract his statements, but was still left with the fact, from the abundance of the mouth, the heart speaks. It was at this time that Billy Graham also began compromising on the ecumenical issue, involving Roman Catholic clergy and hierarchy in his evangelistic crusades and so forth. And there was a general concern among many believers who had always admired and supported Billy Graham of the direction that he began to go in several areas, one of which was political. But this came back again with Jerry Falwell trying to back Ronald Reagan. Although Jimmy Carter had professed to be a born-again Christian, Jerry Falwell made this campaign for Reagan a Christian cause, an evangelical cause. And he began using his gospel hour and his television ministry as a political platform, in effect, to muster Christians into supporting Ronald Reagan against the legacy of Mr. Carter, who had said he was a born-again Christian. This went on, and there were great efforts by Mr. Falwell to portray Ronald Reagan as God's agent or God's man or as a believer, as a saved Christian even. Well, a number of things were against this background. Like Jimmy Carter, Jerry Falwell came from a segregated church background that didn't like black people or didn't let them into his Bible college or into his church. Now, he changed, and he changed his position, claiming that God convicted him. But most people said he changed because society changed, because of the civil rights movement. It was no longer tenable or plausible for him to continue to maintain his segregationist position. I don't judge him or his legacy. I'm simply saying that he had been a segregationist, and an avowed segregationist. He'd also been a yellow dog Democrat. That is a Southern segregationist Democrat. At that time, the Democratic Party was still very much the party of slavery, Jim Crow, and the Ku Klux Klan. And that was the background, the political milieu that both Jimmy Carter and Jerry Falwell came from. And not only them. Robert Byrd, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, had been a Grand Dragon in the Ku Klux Klan. And he had been something of a mentor to Hillary Clinton. Bill Clinton's mentor was George Favor, again, a Southern segregationist Democrat. And the father of Al Gore, another liberal, had been a vehement opponent to the civil rights of blacks. He, again, had been a Southern yellow dog Democrat. They were sometimes called Dixiecrats. This is where it came from. Now, it is interesting to see that some black people are beginning to wake up and realize that the Democratic Party was the party of slavery, of the Ku Klux Klan, and of segregation. And they're beginning to vote Republican again because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. It was the party of emancipation and abolitionism, broadly speaking. That began to shift with Lyndon Johnson. The Democratic Party was rebranded as the party in favor of blacks and things of this. This happened with Lyndon Johnson. But now it seems to be possibly going back to the way it was historically, where people understood the Democrats were no friends of the black people, and many black people have arrived at that conclusion. In any event, at this particular time period of the Reagan candidacy, Jerry Falwell was out there campaigning and making it a virtual Christian cause. Jerry Falwell found himself caught in a financial scandal during the famine in Ethiopia. Mengistu, the communist dictator who succeeded the regime of Haile Selassie, Mengistu was bombing the food supplies out of Djibouti, the international food aid coming into Djibouti. He was using starvation as a military weapon against his own people. He was a horrible, horrible man. And these famines were in the Horn of Africa were outrageous. Outrageous, with the little children with the swelled stomachs and so forth. Jerry Falwell went on television in America and said, we're running out of funds to help these people. Well, the U.S. State Department published a list of American organizations and NGOs that were involved in the feeding programs in Ethiopia. And neither Jerry Falwell's Thomas Road Baptist Church nor Liberty University, as it became, nothing to do with Jerry Falwell, was even involved in it. But he was using it to raise money to help blacks when, in fact, he was not helping the blacks in Ethiopia, at least, which he claimed he was. This became a mini scandal. But others said that was consistent with the kind of operator he was. Meanwhile, however, other things began to take place. Ronald Reagan, who was a Freemason, was elected president. Ronald Reagan was a man who was divorced and remarried, and he was about the first president who was ever divorced and remarried. And this would have been something that a more conservative and traditional generation of evangelical Christian voters would have found troubling. But the powers that be in the Republican Party and their religious associates went to great lengths to downplay, to ignore, to smooth over the fact that Ronald Reagan was a divorcee and remarried. It was a big deal then. There was still some semblance of holy matrimony being sacrosanct and God-hating divorce. But Falwell didn't raise this issue at all. He wanted to get Mr. Reagan elected. Well, Mr. Reagan did get elected. But problems began to emerge with Mr. Falwell. Mr. Falwell, of course, invited Sun Myung Moon, the Korean cult leader, founder of the Unification Church. I've spoken of this before, to address the student body and faculty at Liberty University. In his book, The Divine Principle, Moon claimed to be the return of Jesus Christ. He literally claimed to be, quote unquote, the Lord of the Second Advent. And he said his first wife was the Holy Spirit. She is now dead. And then he got a second wife who's now called Mother Moon. And Moon is dead. But Moon had been convicted on federal charges, and he was in prison for 2 years for tax fraud and for violating American charities laws. He was a convicted felon. This was Moon. Yet Jerry Falwell, the political preacher and the evangelical voice of Reagan's republicanism, brings him into Liberty and calls this self-professed Christ an unsung hero. Now, Billy Graham had gone on television, on national nighttime TV, and said publicly that Moon was a false prophet. Jerry Falwell said he was an unsung hero. Well, why is a preacher, an evangelical preacher, calling somebody who says he's the return of Jesus Christ an unsung hero? And neither the faculty nor the trustees of Liberty University did anything. They just went along with it. It was an absolute disgrace. But then there was Mr. Reagan. Mr. Reagan assured Christian America he was pro-life. He did absolutely nothing about abortion as president. No legislation, nothing. Nothing against abortion when he became president. On the contrary, he did the opposite. His first appointee to the U.S. Supreme Court was a Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, who had been a well-known and established pro-abortion judge. She was one of the most pro-abortion judicial figures in the United States. And having used evangelical Christians to get himself elected, courtesy of Falwell, he appoints this pro-abortion judge. She was the teammate of another pro-abortion judge who was also now deceased, Ruth Ginsburg. But these two women were on the Supreme Court, both very pro-abortion. Although Ginsburg did say that the Roe versus Wade decision was judicially weak in its argumentation. They were both pro-abortion. And she's appointed by Reagan. The judge in California who outlawed Proposition 8 was a homosexual judge. He was appointed by Bush to the bench, but he was nominated by Reagan. And in his judicial decision, when he just reversed the Democratic will of the majority of voters in California to preserve same-sex marriage, he literally, in a legal written decision, faulted Christianity for homophobia, him being a homosexual himself, nominated by Ronald Reagan. Reagan was all talk. He was a Hollywood actor who played the role of a conservative to manipulate people, but when he got in, he did the opposite of what he said, certainly in multiple areas. Many people, including fiscal conservatives, were concerned that he pushed the American deficits to levels not seen before. The biggest deficits in the federal budget in history came under Ronald Reagan, who in effect looted Social Security to fund defense spending. Now, this defense spending, of course, was an arms race with the Soviet Union that eventually saw the fall of the Soviet Union, but it was paid for with credit cards. There were many conservatives, even people in his own government, that quit over it or got in trouble over it, like David Stockman, his budget director, or Murray Wiedenbaum, a Jewish economist who was his advisor. And they were telling him, you can't do this. But he did it anyway. So there were concerns in fiscal areas about his alleged conservatism. He was not a fiscal conservative. There were also concerns about his claims to be a defense conservative, despite his arms buildup. When Poland went into economic insolvency, he had the American taxpayer guarantee the interest on the communist Polish debt under Jaruzelski before the Iron Curtain came down. He did this. He also continued to pursue trade policies favorable, very favorable, not only to Japan, but to China, and these came to the detriment, longer term, of the United States. In any event, that's political. Then there were other things. He was surrounded by people who represented corporate interests from companies like Bechtel, who had massive contracts with the Saudi Arabians. His defense minister, Weinberger, his defense secretary, his Secretary of State, Schultz, the same. They had come from the corporate world, from corporate interests who were involved with the Saudi Arabians, as was George Bush. George Bush had also been a member of David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission at the same time Carter was. I'm speaking of George Bush Sr. I was in Haifa, Israel. When what is now called Hezbollah blew up the American embassy. American Marines were left deployed in a very vulnerable position. The chief of staff, the commandant of the Marines, gave testimony before Congress that was not exactly, I would say, it was not exactly accurate. These Marines were in a vulnerable position. But the flight time to Rambam Medical Center in Haifa, Israel, where they were extremely experienced in battle trauma. All the physicians spoke fluent English. Operating theaters. It was about 25 minutes medevac time by helicopter. 25 minutes medevac time by helicopter, maybe even 20 minutes to Haifa from Beirut. The Reagan administration were having these wounded Marines medevaced to Queen Charlotte Hospital, a British military hospital in Cyprus, and from there they were going on to Wiesbaden, Germany, to a U.S. Air Force hospital. Now, can you imagine if you were a Marine, or if your father or your brother or your son was a wounded Marine, and the American government was not getting him to the nearest operating table? These guys were arriving DOA. This really happened. There was a concern that we don't want to offend the Saudi Arabians. This was the whole Bush ethos. George Bush basically ran Ronald Reagan's foreign policy in many respects. And he was a trilateralist, and he was in bed with the Saudis. The whole Bush family have been partnered with the Saudis through the Carlyle Group financially in terms of investments and so forth, but I digress. So this happened with Reagan. Where is he really at with Israel? But it goes beyond that. Sandra Day O'Connor writes the Supreme Court's decision against Judge Moore in Alabama, ordering the Ten Commandments out of the state judicial building in Alabama. A Reagan judge, a Reagan-appointed pro-abortion judge wrote that decision. It was a Reagan-nominated judge, a homosexual, who outlawed Proposition 8. This was Ronald Reagan. But then we find out something else. Although he denied it and just basically said, I don't remember, he may have had incipient dementia. He may have been telling the truth. But he first denied it and then admitted it. The Countrygate scandal. The United States was providing armaments to terrorist Iran. The same terrorist Iran that sieged the U.S. Embassy hostages under the Carter administration that preceded him. Now he's providing them with weapons. It was an ugly scandal. He denied it. And then when he was found to be not telling the truth, he admitted it. But just kept saying, I don't remember. His defense secretary, Weinberger, ultimately wound up in jail. It was a mess. Reagan's cabinet and his inner staff, Poindexter and Meese, and Weinberger, these people were all indicted, some went to prison. He had a corrupt, sleazy administration. But then we found out that Mr. Reagan, again, strongly endorsed and supported by Jerry Falwell, had a second wife named Nancy, who was having clairvoyance and fortune tellers to the White House, who was doing astrology horoscopes. And it was well known by people in his administration admitted that Ronald Reagan was highly reliant upon the advice of his wife more than most presidents, possibly because he was beginning to suffer incipient dementia. He once made a speech where he said, it's well known that trees cause 85% of pollution. This is absurd, but he actually said that. And his wife began coaching him. Well, his wife's advising him, but she's being advised by Gene Dixon and by astrologers and by fortune tellers. This is witchcraft. This is makshafut going on in the White House. The Reagan White House was saturated in witchcraft. He was a Mason. Yet, it was born-again Christians who got him elected, thinking he was some kind of a Christian figure. We have seen this happen before. The lies, the betrayal, the occult, the corruption. That's what it was. Politics is a filthy business for filthy people. We're called to pray for those in authority, and we should, but that doesn't mean it's not a filthy business with filthy people. My problem is when evangelical preachers and leaders are the proponents of the filth. But that's what happened. So it's not the first time we've seen this kind of connection with Antichrist and things like this happening, and this kind of betrayal of evangelical Christians, of born-again Christians, or of Israel and the Jews. It's not the first time we have seen this, by any means. But let's look further. Now we have Donald Trump. I myself have highlighted the fact that I found it concerning, at least something we should note, that it would be the Antichrist who would bring a false peace to the Middle East. There will be no lasting peace in the Middle East until Jesus reigns from the throne of David. He and he alone will bring a lasting global peace and a lasting peace to the Middle East. And I had concerns about the Abraham Accords. Now, politically, it made sense. And I don't say there was no motive on back of it. And I did note the fact that Jared Kushner, Mr. Trump's son-in-law, who was married to his daughter, and he has a daughter who converted to Judaism, Donald Trump has Jewish grandchildren. Yet I've seen left-wing journalists on MSNBC, among other things, accusing him not only of racism, but anti-Semitism. He has Jewish grandchildren, and they're calling him anti-Semite. It's unbelievable. He's been lied against so much, it's unfathomable by the media. Nonetheless, let's look at this. Mr. Kushner is Jewish, the Jew from New York. He is somebody who is, among other things, the proprietor of a well-known office building in Manhattan, 666 Fifth Avenue. In my youth, there was a restaurant on top of it called Top of the Sixes. Top of the Sixes. It was a very well-known restaurant in Manhattan on top of this well-known skyscraper, commercial office building. And he did broker the Abraham Accords, trying to see a peace between Christianity with a small c, Judaism, that is Talmudic Judaism, and Islam, and trying to make a peace treaty between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates in order to outmaneuver Iran and so forth. Again, politically, I can understand the logic in it, but I also understand biblical prophecy. The Antichrist will bring a false peace to the Middle East in his efforts to counterfeit Christ. All I'm saying is, take it into account, beware of that. But concerning Mr. Trump himself, when I see people saying these things, I don't know what Bible they're really reading, or if they're reading one at all. The 5 reasons why Donald Trump cannot be the Antichrist. Look with me, please, to the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 37. He'll show no regard for the gods of his fathers. Now that term, remember, Elohim in Hebrew is plural. It could be understood as Yahweh, or it could be understood as pagan gods. Different scholars have argued differently, but you cannot rule out it's Yahweh. He'll have no regard for the gods of his fathers, that is his ancestors, or for the desire of women. He'll magnify himself above them all of the gods. He'll have no regard for women. Remember, the Antichrist will attempt to counterfeit Christ, or to pre-counterfeit Christ, both counterfeit and pre-counterfeit. Jesus will bring a lasting peace to the Middle East. The Antichrist will make a treaty, break it, betray Israel, and bring a false peace. He has to try to counterfeit Christ. So too, Jesus was single. He was going to go to the cross to atone for our sin. He did not need a wife and children. It would have been an obstacle to his calling and his mission. Hence, Jesus was single. He had no regard for women in any romantic sense of the word. There were women he knew and loved, like Mary and Martha and Mary Magdalene and so forth. However, Jesus was not romantically inclined towards women. Now we have some outrageous people saying that Jesus was homosexual today. We have homosexual activists proclaiming him to be one of them on that basis. This is obviously absurd and blasphemous, but that is what some of them are saying. I've seen video clips of them saying it. But the Antichrist will not have any regard for women. Mr. Trump is on his fourth marriage. Fourth. His earlier wife had been Ivanka, but he had other wives. One of the things he's repeatedly accused of is misogyny. Now, I find it hypocritical he's accused of misogyny by the opposite political party, who don't seem to have a problem with biological males with a natural orthomuscular advantage competing against female athletes, and even cases where female athletes have been injured. Where is their concern for women? Is that misogyny? I think it is. Or saying that your underage daughter has to share locker room and shower facilities with a biological male. Well, Mr. Trump's critics who are calling him a misogynist go with these kind of things. They're completely hypocritical. What's obvious is it's not about misogyny in Daniel 11:37. It's about a regard for women. The Antichrist will not have a regard for women. Donald Trump plainly does. Multiple marriages, and there have been recordings of sexually aggressive behavior and remarks that are of a rather profane nature concerning women and sexuality, for which he has apologized, of course. Nonetheless, you cannot say that Donald Trump has no regard for women. This will be a firm characteristic of the Antichrist. Donald Trump simply does not qualify. Look with me, please, to the book of Revelation, chapter 13, please. Verse 1 and verse 11. And he stood on the end of the seashore, on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his heads were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. This, of course, goes back to Daniel, beginning in chapter 7. We then have, same chapter, verse 11. I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. Ronald Reagan did have a clergyman claiming to be evangelical, or was evangelical, who you could put in the mold of a false prophet because he proclaimed an Antichrist to be a hero. You could say that about Falwell. Mr. Trump does not have anyone like that as his right-hand man, the way Ronald Reagan did. He has evangelical preachers who like him and endorse him, but nothing like you saw with Reagan and Jerry Falwell. Be that as it may, one beast out of the earth, one out of the sea. Geographically, Donald Trump is from New York City. He's an American, he's a New Yorker, a native New Yorker. He has an accent like mine. He's from New York. People in New York, New Jersey, that's where he's from. He has a house in New Jersey. He has Trump Tower in Manhattan. He was born in Queens, not far from Kennedy Airport. He doesn't come from the sea. That sea being the nations of the Mediterranean, of the Greco-Roman Empire, of the Levant, of Southern Europe or of Europe, North Africa. He does not have any geographical association. Neither, however, does he have any ethnic association. His mother is of Hebrides Scottish descent. His mother can actually speak Scottish Gaelic, or she could speak Scottish Gaelic. The last revival that took place in Great Britain in the Hebrides in the late 1940s under the preaching of Duncan Campbell was something that came about as a result of years of praying and fasting and intercession for revival to come to the Hebrides. And Donald Trump's great aunt was one of the women meeting in a cottage praying for this revival. He does have evangelical heritage on his mother's side of the family in the Hebrides of Scotland, and strongly so. Not too far away, also on the west coast of Scotland, he has his golf resort called Turnberry. So he has business interests there, he has family roots there. Scotland was never, ever part of the Roman Empire. The Emperor Hadrian, the same emperor who built Aerolina Capitolina, of course, built Hadrian's Wall across the north of England to keep the Scottish and the Pict invaders out. His mother was a Scottish Celt. No association with the Roman Empire whatsoever. The Roman Empire ended in the north of England. It ended, the last major city was York in England, which is where Constantine, who had been a Roman general, became the emperor before coming back to Rome. So he is not in any way maternally descendant from the ancient Roman Empire. He's a Celt, Scot. Paternally, his father's family were from Holland, Dutch. There's only a small section of Holland, of modern Netherlands, that was under the Roman Empire. Holland was never part of the Roman Empire. Never. Never. He doesn't come from the sea, ethnically or geographically. Neither does he come from the earth. Again, the Antichrist will have to counterfeit Christ and in some way have a Jewish identity. It may be a partial Jewish identity, like Herod the Great, a religious identity. I point you to the book I authored, Shadows of the Beast, where we explain how Herod is a major type of the Antichrist. He was ethnically an Arab, an Idumean. He was by citizenship and culture a Roman, but by religion, howbeit a religion of convenience, he was a Jew. Donald Trump has no Jewish religious or ethnic identity. He has Jewish grandchildren and a daughter who converted to it, Jewish son-in-law, but he has no Jewish identity himself. The Antichrist will have to make a covenant with the Jews and persuade them he's some kind of a Messiah figure, and Jews are not going to accept a non-Jew as a Messiah. Now, there's much more to it than this. I'd point you to the book Shadows of the Beast. Like Herod, the Arabs will think he's one of them. The Europeans will think the Antichrist is one of them. The Jews will think he's one of them. That is my best understanding, but Donald Trump is not one of them. So on the basis of the beast from the earth, the beast of the sea, neither geographically nor ethnically does he qualify. Let us look at verse 14 of this same chapter, Revelation chapter 13, verse 14. He deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the sign which was given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who had the wound of the sword and came to life. Donald Trump was shot in the ear by an assassin aiming for his brain, obviously. I do not doubt that the Lord preserved Donald Trump's life. He turned his head at the exact right instance. God preserved his life. But he did not have a fatal head wound. It goes on, however, that the beast, the Antichrist, is going to cause all, the small, the great, the rich, the poor, the free men, the slaves, everybody. It is going to be a global phenomena. A global phenomena. Now, we are told there will be sections of Jordan not given into his hand. But he is going to have a political, economic control of the world that will be global, provides no one should be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. The political enemies, opponents of Donald Trump are the globalists. He is a populist and an American nationalist. USA, make America great again. Number one. He's also an Anglophile. He's pro-British. And he is a Judeophile. He's pro-Jewish and pro-Israel. But he is an American. He is not a globalist. He has spoken out against the globalists, and it is the globalist interests who hate him the most. It is the pro-globalists like Soros who are his enemies. Now look, I'm not defending everything he does or says. He wanted to extend the fetal heartbeat law in Florida to allow abortions at a later time period of gestation. He held a homosexual, gay, and lesbian gala at Mar-a-Lago. He's actually appointed a Treasury Secretary, Bassett, who worked for Soros in his present cabinet. He's not as pro-life as I would like him to be. In these things, these moral issues, we can say he's a lesser of two evils. But a lesser of evils is an evil no less. I'm not lifting him up as a saint or some evangelical hero or anything of this nature, and I think those who do so are very naive. I do pray for him, and I do thank God that Harris did not get elected. However, he is not a globalist. He is opposed to globalism, at least he always has been thus far. And the globalists are his mortal enemies. They despise him. Let's continue. The Antichrist will have a globalist agenda of some description. I believe that the same as the European Union is a precursor to the prophecies of Daniel 2 concerning the Antichrist. I believe globalism is a precursor to the prophecies of Revelation chapter 13 concerning the Antichrist. Donald Trump does not fit into that groove ideologically, at least not yet. He's been opposed to it, and they have opposed him. He's not a globalist. Chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. Turn with me to Daniel chapter 7. Verse 8. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up from among them. And the three of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it, and behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great things. Now, this is a prophecy that applied to Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a type, a foreshadowing of the Antichrist to come. Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, from the Seleucid era, against whom the Maccabees contended. A little horn. When Alexander the Great died after defeating the Persians, that is the Iranians, as they are now known, his empire was divided to four of his generals, the two most important being Seleucus, who controlled Syria and Lebanon, this area, and Ptolemy in the south. And then there was a conflict. Antiochus was a little horn. He was not a major player. He came up almost inconspicuously out of nowhere. His rise was meteoric, but he was not even the first of the dynasty in the Seleucids. He was Antiochus, not the first, not the second, not the third. He was Antiochus the fourth when he rose. He was an obscure figure who came out of nowhere. Donald Trump was a rather flamboyant millionaire. And he was a marketing guru who had the most watched television program in the United States that was also viewed in multiple other countries. This was Donald Trump. He was a marketing guru, branding. He had Trump this, Trump that, Trump hotels, Trump golf resorts. He even had Trump steaks and Trump all sorts of things. He was a branding guru and a marketing guru, but a very, very popular television figure. Very popular. He did not come up out of obscurity. He was a household name. Everybody knew who he was. People would imitate him. You're fired. You're fired. The Apprentice. You're fired. He's not a little horn. There was nothing little about him. He was a very flamboyant figure, some would say boisterous. He didn't come out of nowhere. Fifth, it does not add up, is Revelation chapter 6. The Antichrist comes on the white horse, the first horseman. But then he's followed by other horsemen. Wars. When Donald Trump was president, he inherited the war with ISIS, but ended it quickly. If Donald Trump had been president, it is likely, in the opinion of most commentators, at least the ones who are not politically motivated but who are objective, that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine. Putin invaded Crimea because he saw the weakness of Barack Obama in Syria and in Iraq. And then he saw the weakness of Biden in Afghanistan. Trump was a strong figure. What has happened in Gaza, October 7th of 2023, would not have happened. What happened in the Ukraine would not have happened, at least not likely, had he been president. North Korea stopped shooting rockets across the Sea of Japan. China was not behaving aggressively towards the Philippines. Ronald Reagan was a man who represented peace through strength. Again, he follows the American philosophy that was coined by the American president, Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, who was distantly related to Franklin Roosevelt. This philosophy is swing softly but carry a big stick. In other words, don't mess with us. Peace through strength. While Barack Obama and Joe Biden placated Iran, Ronald Reagan stood up to Iran and stood up for Israel. The others did the opposite. Peace prevailed during his presidency. Peace through strength. There were no wars except the one he inherited with ISIS, who he bombed to smithereens and closed down practically overnight. When Soleimani was becoming aggressive, he killed Soleimani, the Iranian general. The Iranians didn't want to mess with Mr. Trump or with America. There were no wars. He was a president who kept the peace. He's been very critical of the Biden administration's policies in the Ukraine, one of the most corrupt countries in the world, certainly the most corrupt in Europe, of which the Biden crime family was involved, Hunter Biden. Reagan knew this. Mr. Trump knew this. He was a president of peace. Peace through strength, but peace. There were no wars. Famines. Food prices were much, much lower. These kinds of wars on farmers you see in Holland and in the United States and in Great Britain and in New Zealand, these wars against farmers, that was not Donald Trump. Inflation was non-existent. Food prices were much, much lower, as were energy prices. He was a president of agricultural abundance and low prices, no inflation. The final of the four horsemen is martyrs. More than any other president in American history, more than any other one, Donald Trump stood up for the religious freedom and human rights of persecuted Christians. He also defended the human rights of others. He opposed anti-Semitism. He spoke out about the Uyghurs and other things who were Muslim. But first of all, he stood up for Christians and Jews. He cannot be associated with martyrdom. These things, these wars, and famines, and martyrdom that follow the white horse are not Donald Trump. All of his policy positions were the opposite. Remember, there'll be many antichrists. The Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, is going to be very subtle and very skilled. He will be the son of perdition, like Judas Iscariot. Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I? He is going to be able to pull the wool over the eyes of many people, including many Christians, up to a point. He's certainly going to con Israel. Donald Trump just does not fit the profile. He does not fit the profile. Now, I don't go to the lengths other people say he's a great hero and a great this and a great that. The evangelicals he surrounded himself with, like Paula White, are people who are a disgrace that he'd be well advised to keep away from. I hope a more balanced evangelical like Governor Huckabee or somebody who's going to be the ambassador to Israel will give him better advice than he got from the kind of theocratic money-preaching hooligans he was surrounded with in his first administration. He's not as pro-life as I wish he was. He's not. He's pro-life with small letters. He is somebody who I wish kept his mouth shut about the homosexual issue. The one thing that Bill Clinton had right, where I have personally agreed with him, is have a policy of don't ask, don't tell. Don't ask, don't tell, which is the most I think can be reasonably hoped for, as opposed to the openly pro-homosexual woke policies of Biden, Harris, Obama, and so forth. He's a lesser of evils in those things. He has blessed Israel. And I believe his blessing of Israel is a reason that God spared his life and blessed him. And I believe the cursing of Israel is a reason God has cursed the Democrats. Don't ask me to explain how 18 U.S. senators tried to pressure Israel with arms embargoes, voting with Bernie Sanders, a Jew, against Israel. A Jew betrays his own people. If you want to find the Jew who will betray his own people, look in the Democratic Party, look at Bernie Sanders. Look at people who will be in a party with Olmert and Alexandra Ortega-Cortez and these other anti-Israel figures. Horrible people. The women in the squad. Horrible. How can somebody like Blumenthal or parley with these people? But he did. How can Jewish American politicians or political odds makers like Axelrod and pundits, how can they be involved with Tlaib or Olmert in the same party, Linda Saucer? How can they? There are betrayers to the Jewish people who are Jews. They're known as Menelausers in Judaism. Again, they go back to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabees. Yeah, there are traitor Jews. There are. Chuck Schumer, I consider to be a traitor Jew. He's in a party with Olmert, with Tlaib, does nothing. Now, there's some Democratic Jews who see this and have spoken up, like Alan Dershowitz, but Schumer hasn't. Okay. Blumenthal hasn't. Where are they? It's most unfortunate indeed. Nonetheless, that's not Donald Trump. He just doesn't fit the profile. The scriptures tell us a number of characteristics to look for concerning the ultimate Antichrist. And Donald Trump is not a good candidate. In fact, I'd say he's not a candidate at all. We need to be watchful. We need to be careful. We certainly need to be alert. But when you see people speculating about Donald Trump and all these kind of things, it's a diversion. It's a diversion. It's simply not what the scriptures tell us to place our focus and concentration. I would urge people to pray for Mr. Trump, for his administration, that he'll be a good president. That'll be good for America. That'll be good for America's allies, that he will be good for Israel. I pray that God protects him. The globalists and others want him dead. And I'm thanking God that we're beginning to see his judgment come on the mainstream media. May it fall brutally and without mercy. But I'm praying for Mr. Trump. I hope he does well by the grace of God. And I hope he grooms somebody to replace him who will carry the same mantle. But even here, I am not happy about the fact that Mr. Vance, as much as I like him politically, converted to Roman Catholicism. That is not a good sign. That is not a good sign. When somebody converts to a false religion, they come under demonic influences to some degree. That's certainly been true of Candace Owen, who converted to Catholicism. Now, I've not seen anything that I'd place in that category with Mr. Vance as yet, but please pray for him. Please pray that he turns to a biblical Christianity. Don't put your faith or hope or trust in Mr. Vance or in Mr. Trump. Just thank God that the other party didn't get elected, and pray that God will keep his hand on them and give them good, biblically based Christian counselors. That's what I'm praying. But this speculations about him being the Antichrist, lend no credence to such speculations. They're not only counterproductive, they're frankly silly. My name is James Jacob Prasch from Moriel Ministries. Thank you so much for listening.